A landlord thought he could throw an old woman into the street. He didn't know Bumpy Johnson was watching, and he definitely didn't know what happens when Bumpy shows up uninvited. Chapter 1. The Eviction Notice. There are moments in Harlem when silence moves faster than noise. A piece of paper slipped under a door. A few typed lines, official stamps, legal language that doesn't care about your name, your history, or how long you've called a place home. Mrs. Adelaide Clark held that paper in her hands like it was something foreign, something that didn't belong in her world. She was 73 years old. She'd lived in that apartment on 139th Street for 26 years, raised 2 sons there, buried a husband from there. The walls knew her voice. The floors remembered her footsteps. But now someone she'd never met was telling her she had 30 days to leave. The letter didn't explain why. It didn't need to. The building had been sold. New ownership. New plans. New money that didn't have room for old tenants who paid old rent. Mrs. Clark sat at her kitchen table and read the notice 3 times. Not because she didn't understand it, but because she couldn't believe it. She wasn't the kind of woman who made trouble. She paid her rent on time, kept to herself, smiled at neighbors in the hallway. She'd survived Harlem in the hard years, the hungry years, the years when you learned not to ask for help because no one had any to give. But this was different. This wasn't something you could survive by being quiet. By the next morning, the whole block knew. That's how Harlem worked. Information didn't need phones or newspapers. It moved through barbershops and corner stores, through church steps and stoop conversations. Mrs. Clark's niece told the grocer. The grocer told the shoeshine man. The shoeshine man told everyone. And in Harlem, when a widow gets disrespected, people remember. They remembered because it could have been their grandmother, their aunt, their mother. But more than that, they remembered because this was the kind of thing that didn't happen here, not without consequence. The new landlord's name was Vincent Morello. He wasn't from the neighborhood. He was from downtown, from the kind of offices where Harlem was just addresses on paper, buildings that could be bought and flipped and cleared out for profit. He'd bought 4 buildings on the block in the last 6 months, renovated 2 of them, raised the rents, pushed out the tenants who couldn't pay. It was legal. It was business. And Vincent Morello didn't care what anyone in Harlem thought about it. He had lawyers. He had money. He had the city on his side. What he didn't have was respect. And in Harlem, that was the only currency that mattered. Mrs. Clark didn't know what to do. She thought about calling her sons, but one lived in Philadelphia and the other worked nights. She thought about going to the church, but the pastor was old and tired and had his own problems. So she did what a lot of people in Harlem did when the world pressed down too hard. She kept living. She made her tea. She sat by the window. She watched the street below and wondered how much longer she'd be able to call it home. But someone else was watching too. There's a rhythm to a neighborhood, a pulse. When something's wrong, people feel it before they see it. A widow sitting too still by a window. A niece walking too fast with worry in her eyes. Conversations that stop when the wrong name gets mentioned. Vincent Morello's name was being mentioned a lot, and in Harlem, there were people who listened. One of them was a man who didn't need to hear his own name to know when he was needed. The word reached him the way it always did, quietly, carefully, with respect. Someone told someone. That someone told someone else. And eventually, it landed in the right ear. Bumpy Johnson didn't live on 139th Street, but he knew the block, he knew the faces, he knew the old women who sat on stoops in the summer and the young men who stood on corners in the winter. He knew Mrs. Clark, not personally, but he knew her type. Now, the ones who built Harlem with their hands and their hearts. The ones who survived when survival wasn't guaranteed. The ones who deserved to live out their years in peace. And now some landlord from downtown thought he could throw her out like trash. Bumpy was sitting in a backroom card game when he heard. He didn't react, didn't stop shuffling, didn't raise his voice. He just asked one question. When's he coming back? Nobody needed to ask who he meant. They told him. 3 days. Vincent Morello was coming back in 3 days to finalize the transition. That's what the notice said. Finalize the transition. Like Mrs. Clark was a contract, a line item, something to be closed out. Bumpy nodded, dealt the next hand, played the game through. But everyone at that table knew. Yeah, Vincent Morello had just made the kind of mistake you don't recover from. He'd disrespected the wrong neighborhood. And worse, he'd done it while Bumpy Johnson was watching. Chapter 2. The Landlord's Mistake. Vincent Morello arrived on 139th Street like a man who owned it. Which, legally, he did. 4 buildings, 12 units each, 48 families who paid him rent, whether they wanted to or not. But ownership on paper and ownership in reality are two very different things. Morello stepped out of a black Cadillac at 10 in the morning. Polished shoes, tailored coat, the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. He wasn't alone. 2 men climbed out behind him. Broad shoulders, cheap suits. The kind of muscle you hire when you expect resistance but don't respect it enough to bring real professionals. When they were there to make sure Mrs. Clark understood that the 30 days weren't a suggestion. Morello walked up the stoop like he was doing everyone a favor. Like evicting a 73-year-old woman was just part of the progress. Part of making the neighborhood better. Better for who? He never asked. A few people stood on the sidewalk, watching. An old man on the corner, a mother with a stroller, a teenager leaning against a lamppost. None of them said anything, but they were all paying attention. Morello knocked on Mrs. Clark's door, hard, 3 times, not the knock of a neighbor. The knock of someone who expected the door to open immediately. It did. Mrs. Clark stood in the doorway, small and tired, holding the eviction notice like it might protect her. Morello smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't friendly, just teeth. Mrs. Clark, Vincent Morello, we spoke on the phone. They hadn't. He'd had his secretary call, left a message, told her the building was under new management and she'd need to vacate. Mrs. Clark nodded, didn't speak. Morello glanced past her into the apartment. Old furniture, family photos on the walls, the smell of coffee and decades of living. I wanted to follow up in person, he said, still smiling. Make sure we're clear on the timeline. 30 days. That's April 15th. You'll need to be out by then. I've lived here 26 years, Mrs. Clark said quietly. Morello's smile didn't change. I understand, but the building's being renovated. New lease terms, market rate. You're currently paying, what, $60 a month? She nodded. Right. Well, after renovations, units like this will go for $250, maybe $300. So you can see why we need to make the transition. Transition. That word again. Like she was cargo being moved. Like her life could be packed into boxes and scheduled around someone else's profit margin. I don't have anywhere to go, Mrs. Clark said. Morello shrugged, not cruelly, just indifferently. That's not really my problem, Mrs. Clark. I'm sure you have family, friends. The city has resources. One of the men behind him chuckled. Low. Mean. Mrs. Clark's hands tightened on the letter. Morello reached into his coat and pulled out another envelope. This is a formal notice. Certified. Legal. If you're still here on the 16th, we'll have to proceed with a partial eviction. I don't want that. You don't want that. So let's keep this simple. He held out the envelope. Mrs. Clark didn't take it. Then Morello's smile finally faded. Ma'am, take the letter. She didn't move. He stepped forward, close enough that she had to look up at him. I said take it. One of his men moved on to the first step, not threatening, just present. Mrs. Clark took the envelope. Morello stepped back, adjusted his coat. Good. 30 days. If you need boxes, there's a moving company I can recommend. He turned and walked back down the steps. His men followed. As he reached the sidewalk, he glanced around at the people watching. The old man, the mother, the kid by the lamppost. Any of you got questions about your leases? Morello called out. My office number's on the notices. We're doing good things here. Upgrading the neighborhood. You'll thank me in a year. Nobody responded. Morello didn't care. He climbed back into the Cadillac. and the engine started. The car pulled away, and Vincent Morello drove off thinking he'd handled it. Thinking 30 days from now, Mrs. Clark would be gone, the apartment would be gutted, and some young couple from Midtown would move in and pay triple. He thought he'd won. But he hadn't noticed the barber shop across the street, hadn't noticed the man sitting in the window, getting a shave, watching the whole thing in the mirror, hadn't noticed the way that man's jaw tightened when Morello stepped too close to Mrs. Clark, or the way the barber stopped mid-stroke and looked at him, or the way the man in the chair said very quietly, "When's he coming back?" Vincent Morello made 3 mistakes that morning. The first was thinking Harlem was just real estate. The second was disrespecting a widow in public. And on the third was not asking who actually ran 139th Street. Because if he had, someone would have told him, and he never would have shown up in the first place. Chapter 3. Bumpy Hers. Bumpy Johnson didn't move when the Cadillac pulled away. He sat in the barber's chair, cape still around his shoulders, face half covered in shaving cream, eyes locked on the street outside. The barber, a man named Earl, who'd been cutting hair in Harlem for 30 years, stood perfectly still, razor in hand, waiting. He knew better than to interrupt. The shop was quiet. 2 other men sat along the wall, pretending to read newspapers. But no one was reading. Everyone had seen what just happened across the street. Everyone knew what it meant. Bumpy watched Mrs. Clark close her door. Watched her disappear back into the apartment that someone had just told her wasn't hers anymore. He watched the people on the sidewalk drift away back to their lives, carrying the story with them. Then he spoke. "Who is he?" Earl lowered the razor. "Name's Vincent Morello. Bought up half the block 6 months ago. Been pushing people out ever since." "Where's he from?" "Downtown. Got an office near City Hall. Real estate, development, that kind of thing." Bumpy was quiet for a moment. Then, "He always bring muscle?" "Every time," Earl said. "Same 2 guys. They don't do much. Just stand there. Make sure nobody argues." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Mrs. Clark got family?" "2 sons. One's in Philly, other works nights at the rail yard. She's mostly alone. She pay her rent? Every month. On time. Hey, been doing it for 26 years. Bumpy's jaw tightened under the shaving cream. "And he's putting her out anyway. Says he's renovating, raising rents, calls it progress." One of the men against the wall, a younger guy named Marcus, spoke up. "It's legal, Bumpy. I asked around. City says if he wants to upgrade the building, he can clear out tenants on old leases. Ain't nothing Mrs. Clark can do." Bumpy turned his head slightly, looked at Marcus in the mirror. "Legal," Bumpy said quietly. "Don't mean right." Marcus nodded quickly, looked down at his newspaper. Bumpy turned back to the window, watched the block for another long moment. Then he said, "When's he coming back?" Earl wiped the razor on a towel. "Hard to say. He usually shows up once, drops the notice, and then sends lawyers for the rest. But if he comes back, then he comes back." Bumpy nodded. "I want to know." "You'll know," Earl said. Bumpy gestured for Earl to continue. The barber stepped forward and resumed the shave. Smooth, steady strokes. The kind of precision that comes from years of practice and absolute focus. Nobody spoke. Outside, Harlem moved like it always did. People walked, cars passed, life continued. But inside the barbershop, something had shifted. It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. But everyone in that room understood. Vincent Morello had just been marked. Not for violence, not for revenge, for correction. Bumpy left the barbershop 20 minutes later, clean-shaven, composed, moving through Harlem like water through stone. Silent, inevitable, impossible to stop. He didn't go to Mrs. Clark's apartment. Didn't knock on her door or introduce himself. That wasn't how this worked. Instead, he walked 2 blocks east to a corner store owned by a man named Louis. Louis had been in Harlem longer than most of the buildings, knew everyone, heard everything. Bumpy stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly. Louis looked up from behind the counter, saw who it was, and nodded. Bumpy. "Louis, what can I do for you?" "Vincent Morello," Bumpy said. "Tell me about him." Louis set down the inventory sheet he'd been working on. "Real estate man. Showed up about a year ago. started buying buildings on the cheap. Old landlords who wanted out, families who couldn't keep up with taxes. He swoops in, buys low, kicks everyone out, renovates, then rents high. How many buildings? 4 on this block. Now maybe a dozen across Harlem. He got protection? Louis shook his head. Not that I know of. He's got lawyers, city connections. Thinks that's enough. He connected to anyone? Not anyone who matters. He's independent. Thinks he's smart. Thinks Harlem's just opportunity. Bumpy leaned against the counter. Quiet. Thinking. Louis waited. Finally, Bumpy asked, he ever hurt anyone? Physically? No. But he's put out maybe 30, 40 families in the last 6 months. Old folks mostly. People who can't afford the new rents. Some of them ended up in shelters. Some moved in with families, some just disappeared. Bumpy's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Louis saw it, and he knew. You gonna talk to him? Louis asked. If he comes back, Bumpy said. And if he don't? Bumpy straightened, adjusted his coat. Then I'll find him. He turned toward the door, then paused. Looked back at Louis. Mrs. Clark needs anything. Groceries, rent, anything. You let me know. Louis nodded. I will. Bumpy stepped outside. The sun was high now. The block was busy. People greeted him as he passed. A nod here. A quiet Bumpy there. He didn't stop. Didn't chat. He walked with purpose, not fast, not slow. Just steady. By the time he reached the end of the block, 3 people had already whispered the news into the right ears. Bumpy was involved. And in Harlem, that changed everything. That night in a card game above a dry cleaner on Lenox Avenue, someone asked Bumpy if he'd heard about the widow on 139th. Bumpy didn't look up from his cards. I heard. You gonna do something? If I need to. Morello's got lawyers, Bumpy. City people. So this ain't some street hustler you can lean on. Bumpy laid down his hand. Full house. Kings over 8s. He collected the pot, then looked at the man who'd asked the question. Lawyers don't mean nothing if you don't got respect, Bumpy said. And respect ain't something you buy. It's something you earn. He stood, pocketed his winnings. Morello's about to learn that. And then he was gone. Chapter 4. The Uninvited Guest. Vincent Morello came back on a Thursday. He didn't plan to, didn't need to. But Mrs. Clark had called his office 3 times that week. Left messages, asked if there was any way she could stay, offered to pay more, begged in the way people beg when they're running out of options. Morello's secretary told him to ignore it. But Morello wanted to make a point. He wanted Mrs. named Clark and anyone else in those buildings to understand that this wasn't a negotiation. This was business. And in business, sentiment didn't matter. So he came back. Same Cadillac. Same 2 men. Same polished confidence. It was just after noon when he pulled up to 139th Street. The block was quieter this time. Fewer people on the sidewalk. A few faces in windows. The old man on the corner wasn't there. Morello didn't notice. He climbed the steps to Mrs. Clark's building, his men flanking him, and knocked on her door. She opened it quickly, hope in her eyes. That hope died the second she saw his face. Mrs. Clark, Morello said flatly, I got your messages. Mr. Morello, please. He held up a hand. I'm not here to discuss it. I'm here to make sure you understand. 2 weeks left, April 15th. If you're still here, that the marshal comes, that's not a threat. That's the law. I don't have anywhere? Then figure it out. His voice wasn't loud, didn't need to be. I've been patient, I've been professional, but I'm done repeating myself. Mrs. Clark's hands trembled. This is my home. No, Morello said coldly. It's my building, and you're a tenant whose lease I'm choosing not to renew. That's how this works. One of his men smirked. Morello turned to leave, and that's when he saw him. Bumpy Johnson, standing in the hallway. Not at the top of the stairs, not outside. Inside the building, on the same floor. 10 feet away. Morello stopped. The 2 men behind him noticed. Tensed. Bumpy didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, hat low, expression completely calm. The hallway suddenly felt smaller. Hey, Morello recovered quickly, smiled. The same empty smile he'd used on Mrs. Clark. "Can I help you?" he asked. Bumpy didn't answer right away. He looked at Morello, then at the two men, then at Mrs. Clark, still standing in her doorway, confused and afraid, then back to Morello. "You the landlord?" Bumpy asked, voice quiet, almost polite. "I am," Morello said. "Vincent Morello, and you are?" Bumpy didn't give his name. He just said, "We need to talk." Morello's smile tightened. "I don't know you." "You will." One of Morello's men stepped forward. "Hey, Mr. Morello's got business. You need to move along." Bumpy's eyes shifted to the man. Didn't blink, didn't react, just looked. The man stopped moving. Something in Bumpy's stillness, something cold and absolute, made him reconsider. Morello noticed. And for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "Look," Morello said, trying to regain control. "I don't know who you are, but this is between me and Mrs. Clark. It's legal business. You're not involved." "I'm involved now," Bumpy said. "And why? You her son? Her lawyer?" "No." "Then what's your interest?" Bumpy took one step forward. Not aggressive, just deliberate. "This is my neighborhood," he said quietly. "These are my people, and you just disrespected one of them." Morello's jaw tightened. "I didn't disrespect anyone. I'm enforcing a lease agreement." "You called her a problem," Bumpy said. "Told her to figure it out. Brought muscle to her door like she's a criminal." "I brought my associates." "You brought threats," Bumpy interrupted, still calm, still quiet. "You came into Harlem and treated an old woman like trash. And you thought no one would care." Morello straightened, tried to stand taller. "I don't know who you think you are. I'm the man telling you this ends today." The hallway went silent. Morello stared at Bumpy, trying to read him, trying to figure out if this was a bluff. Bumpy stared back. No emotion, no urgency, just certainty. Morello's men shifted their weight, looked at each other. One of them whispered something. Morello ignored them. "You threatening me?" "No," Bumpy said. "I'm explaining something to you." "Explaining what?" "How Harlem works." Morello laughed, short, forced. "I know how Harlem works. I own property here. I employ people here. I'm invested in this community." "You own buildings," Bumpy said. "No, that ain't the same as belonging." "I don't need to belong. I need to make a living." "Then make it somewhere else." Morello's smile vanished completely. "I'm not going anywhere." Bumpy nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. "Then we should talk," he said. "Somewhere private. I'm not going anywhere with you. Not asking you to leave. Mrs. Clark's apartment is right here. We can sit, have a conversation, like adults." Morello glanced at Mrs. Clark. She looked terrified. Then at his men. They looked uncertain. Then back at Bumpy. And he realized something. No one had threatened him. No one had raised a voice. No one had touched him. But he was afraid. Not of violence, of something worse. Of being irrelevant. Of realizing that all his money, all his lawyers, all his legal paperwork meant nothing in this hallway, on this block, in front of this man. Morello swallowed. "Fine. 5 minutes." Bumpy gestured toward Mrs. Clark's apartment. "After you." Morello hesitated, then walked inside. His men started to follow. Bumpy raised a hand, gentle, firm. "They stay outside," he said. Morello turned back. "They're with me." "Not for this." Morello looked at his men, looked at Bumpy, looked at the narrow hallway that suddenly felt like a trap. He nodded to his men. "Wait here." They didn't like it, but they obeyed. Bumpy stepped aside. Let Morello enter Mrs. Clark's apartment, then followed him in, and closed the door. Chapter 5. A conversation about respect. The apartment was small, neat, the kind of place that had been lived in carefully for decades. A couch with crocheted armrests. A coffee table with magazines stacked precisely. Photos on every surface. Weddings, graduations, babies. The history of a family frozen in frames. Mrs. Clark stood near the kitchen, hands clasped, watching two men she barely understood occupy her living room. Bumpy gestured to the couch. Sit. Morello didn't want to, but he did. Bumpy didn't sit. He stood near the window, hands still in his pockets, calm, patient, like he had all the time in the world. Morello tried to take control. Look, mister, you know what I do? Bumpy asked, cutting him off. Morello blinked. No, I protect people, Bumpy said simply. People who can't protect themselves. People who get pushed around by men like you. I'm not pushing anyone. You are. Bumpy's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. You walked in here. Now told a 73-year-old woman she's got 2 weeks to disappear. Brought muscle to make sure she understood. That's pushing. Morello shifted on the couch. It's business. It's not personal. Everything's personal, Bumpy said. You just don't see it that way because you're not the one getting hurt. I'm following the law. The law, Bumpy repeated. He looked out the window, watched the street below. You think the law's going to protect you here? I think I have rights. You got paperwork, Bumpy interrupted. Rights are different. Rights are earned. And you haven't earned nothing in Harlem except enemies. Morello's hands clenched. Who do you think you are? Bumpy finally looked at him. Really looked at him. I'm the man who's giving you a chance, he said quietly. A chance most people don't get. A chance to what? To do the right thing. Morello laughed, bitter, defensive. The right thing? I bought these buildings legally. I have every right to manage them how I see fit. You got the right to be a fool, Bumpy said. And that's what you're being. I'm a businessman. You're a stranger. Bumpy's tone was calm, almost gentle, but the words cut. You came into a neighborhood you don't understand, disrespected people you don't know, and now you're sitting here telling me about rights. He stepped away from the window, moved closer, not threatening, just present. Let me explain something to you, Mr. Morello, Bumpy said. Harlem don't work like downtown. It don't work like your office buildings and your boardrooms. Here, people look out for each other. Here, respect matters more than contracts. That's not how the world works. That's how this world works. Bumpy's voice was steel wrapped in silk. And you're in it now, whether you like it or not. Morello stood up, tried to reclaim some authority. I'm not afraid of you. Bumpy didn't move. You should be, but not because I'm going to hurt you. Then why? Because I represent something you can't buy, something you can't lawyer your way around. I represent the neighborhood, and when you disrespect one of us, you disrespect all of us. Morello's jaw worked. So what? You're going to threaten me, rough me up? That's your play. No, Bumpy said. I'm going to give you a choice. What choice? Bumpy stepped back, gave Morello space, made it clear this wasn't about intimidation. This was about education. You got two options, Bumpy said. Option one, you tear up Mrs. Clark's eviction notice. You let her stay. You charge her the same rent she's been paying for 26 years, and you leave her alone. Morello scoffed. That's not an option. That's a loss. That's respect, Bumpy corrected. And in Harlem, respect's the only thing that keeps you safe. Safe from what? Bumpy didn't answer, just watched him. Morello felt the weight of that silence. What's option two? He asked. Option two, Bumpy said slowly, is you keep doing what you're doing. You evict Mrs. Clark. You bring your lawyers. You renovate the apartment. You raise the rent. And you'll make money, Bumpy said, for a while. What's that mean? Bumpy tilted his head slightly. It means things get difficult. Construction delays, permit problems, tenants who don't pay on time, repairs that cost more than they should, vandalism, fires, the kind of problems that don't show up in legal paperwork, but make your life very expensive. Morello's face flushed. You're threatening me. I'm explaining consequences, Bumpy said. There's a difference. You can't. I ain't doing nothing, Bumpy said calmly. But Harlem's a complicated place. Things happen. Buildings get hard to manage. People stop cooperating. Money dries up. And suddenly your investment ain't worth what you thought it was. He let that sit. Morello stared at him, trying to decide if this was real, if this quiet, composed man in front of him could actually make good on what he was implying. Bumpy stepped toward the door. "You got 24 hours to decide? And if I don't?" Bumpy opened the door, looked back. "Then you'll learn the hard way." He stepped into the hallway. Morello followed, angry now. "You think you run this neighborhood? You think you're untouchable?" Bumpy stopped, turned. "I don't run nothing," he said quietly. "I just make sure things stay fair. And right now, you're making things unfair." "I'll call the police." "Go ahead." Bumpy's expression didn't change. "Tell them a man asked you to treat an old woman with respect. See what they say." Morello's men stepped forward. One of them reached for Bumpy's shoulder. Bumpy didn't flinch, didn't move. He just looked at the hand, then at the man's face. The man froze, then slowly pulled his hand back. Bumpy turned to Morello one last time. 24 hours, he said. "After that, you're on your own." And then he walked down the hallway, down the stairs, out into the Harlem sunlight. Calm, unhurried, untouchable. Morello stood in the hallway, fists clenched, breathing hard. One of his men leaned close. "Boss, we should go." Morello wanted to argue, wanted to call the police, wanted to prove he wasn't scared. But he was. Not because Bumpy had threatened him, but because Bumpy hadn't needed to. Everything about the man, the stillness, the certainty, the quiet authority, told Morello something he didn't want to believe. That in this neighborhood, on this block, Vincent Morello's money meant nothing, and Bumpy Johnson's word meant everything. They left 5 minutes later. Mrs. Clark watched from her window as the Cadillac pulled away. She didn't understand what had just happened, but she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Chapter 6. The widow stays. Vincent Morello didn't sleep that night. He sat in his downtown office, door locked, lights off, staring at the paperwork spread across his desk. Eviction notices, lease agreements, property deeds, legal documents that said he was right. That said he had the power. That said he could do whatever he wanted with buildings he owned. But none of those papers explained what had happened in that hallway. None of them explained the fear. He'd been in business for 15 years, bought properties in 3 boroughs, dealt with angry tenants, hostile city officials, rival developers who played dirty. He'd never backed down. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't like any of them. Bumpy hadn't yelled, hadn't threatened, hadn't even raised his voice. He'd just stood there, calm, certain, like he already knew how this was going to end. And somehow, that was worse than any threat. Morello picked up the phone 3 times that night. Almost called the police. Almost called his lawyer. Almost called someone who could tell him he was overreacting. But he didn't. Because deep down, he knew. The law couldn't help him here. By morning, Morello had made his decision. He told himself it was strategic, practical, that it didn't make sense to fight over one apartment when he had 11 others in the building. He told himself Mrs. Clark wasn't worth the trouble, but the truth was simpler. He was afraid of what would happen if he said no. At 9 a.m., he drove back to 139th Street. No muscle this time, no associates, just him. The block looked different in the daylight, less threatening. Just people going about their lives. But Morello felt eyes on him the moment he stepped out of the car. The old man was back on the corner. A woman swept her stoop. A group of kids played stickball in the street. They all watched. Morello climbed the steps to Mrs. Clark's building, knocked on her door. She opened it slowly. Suspicious now, guarded. "Mr. Morello," he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Clark, I've reconsidered." She didn't respond, just waited. "The eviction," he continued. "It's not necessary. You can stay." Her eyes widened. "I can?" "Yes, same terms, same rent. I'll have my office send over a new lease. Month to month, if that works for you." Mrs. Clark's hands went to her mouth. "Oh, my lord. Thank you. Thank you." Morello nodded stiffly. "It's fine. I reviewed the situation. It made sense to keep long-term tenants. Stability. Good for the building." He was lying, and they both knew it. But Mrs. Clark didn't care why. She just cared that she could stay. God bless you, she whispered. Morello turned to leave, then paused. Mrs. Clark, the man who was here yesterday. Do you know him? She shook her head. No, I'd never seen him before. But he said this was his neighborhood. It is, she said simply. Harlem takes care of its own, always has. Morello nodded slowly, then walked away. As he descended the steps, he saw someone standing across the street. Bumpy Johnson, leaning against a lamppost, watching. Their eyes met. Bumpy didn't smile and didn't nod, didn't acknowledge what had just happened. He just watched Morello get into his car and drive away. And that was enough. Word spread through Harlem faster than Morello's Cadillac could leave the neighborhood. Mrs. Clark could stay. The widow on 139th Street wasn't getting evicted. The landlord had changed his mind. But everyone knew the truth. He hadn't changed his mind. He'd been changed. By a quiet conversation, by a calm presence, by a man who didn't need to shout or threaten to make his point, by Bumpy Johnson. 3 days later, Mrs. Clark received her new lease in the mail. Month to month, same rent. No increase. She signed it with shaking hands and hung it on her refrigerator like a diploma. That Sunday, she went to church and thanked God for the miracle. But she also thanked someone else. A man she'd never formally met. A man whose name she'd only heard whispered. And a man who'd stood in her hallway and changed her life without asking for anything in return. After the service, she stopped by the barber shop on her way home. Earl was sweeping up. Saw her through the window and smiled. She came inside. Excuse me. Earl set down the broom. Mrs. Clark. Good to see you. She hesitated. I wanted to thank someone, the man who helped me. But I don't know how to reach him. Earl nodded slowly. He knows. But I haven't. He knows, Earl repeated gently. That's how Bumpy works. He don't need thanks. He just needs people to be safe. Mrs. Clark's eyes filled with tears. Tell him I'll pray for him. I will, Earl said. She left a $5 bill on the counter. For his next haircut. Earl smiled. He'll appreciate that. Mrs. Clark walked home. Then, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like the apartment was truly hers again. Not because of paperwork, but because someone had decided it was worth protecting. Vincent Morello sold the building 6 months later. He told people it was a business decision, that the numbers didn't work, that Harlem wasn't the market he thought it was. But the real reason was simpler. Every time he drove down 139th Street, he felt it. The weight of eyes, the memory of that hallway, the quiet certainty in Bumpy Johnson's voice. You're on your own. Morello didn't want to find out what that meant. So he sold, took a small loss, moved his investments to Brooklyn, and never set foot in Harlem again. Bumpy Johnson never spoke about it, never mentioned Mrs. Clark, never brought up Morello, never claimed credit. That wasn't his way. He didn't do things for recognition, didn't do them for gratitude. He did them because they needed to be done. Because in Harlem, respect wasn't negotiable, and neither was justice. People remembered, though, that they remembered the widow who almost lost her home. They remembered the landlord who backed down. And they remembered the man who made it happen without firing a shot, without throwing a punch, without breaking a single law. Just by showing up. Just by standing in a hallway and explaining how things worked. Just by being Bumpy Johnson. Years later, long after Mrs. Clark had passed away peacefully in that same apartment, long after Morello had left New York entirely, long after the buildings had changed hands a dozen more times, people still told the story. About the day a landlord tried to throw out a widow, and the day Bumpy Johnson showed up uninvited. They told it in barbershops and on street corners, at family dinners and church gatherings, not as a legend, not as folklore, but as a lesson. A reminder that in Harlem, power wasn't about money or lawyers or who had the law on their side. Power was about respect. And respect was something you couldn't buy. You earned it. Or someone like Bumpy Johnson taught you why you should have tried. Mrs. Adelaide Clark lived in that apartment for another 11 years. She watched the neighborhood change, watched new people move in, watched buildings rise and fall. But she never forgot the day a stranger stood in her hallway and fought for her without her asking. She never knew his full story, never understood why he cared, but she didn't need to. She just knew that in Harlem, when the world pressed down too hard, someone was watching, someone was listening, and if you were lucky, someone like Bumpy Johnson would show up uninvited and make sure you stayed home.